Imagine knowing that one of the biggest financial disasters in history was coming, and then betting against it. Sounds like an easy way to become rich, right? It wasn't. For Michael Burry, it meant years of watching his own investors lose patience, while everyone else seemed to be getting richer. And for a while, it looked like Burry was completely wrong. But let's go back to the beginning. In the early 2000s, America's housing market looked unstoppable. House prices were rising, banks were making money, people were buying homes, and investors were making fortunes. There was just one problem. Almost nobody was asking, what happens if people stop paying their mortgages? Burry was. He had a background that made him unusual for a Wall Street investor. He was actually a doctor. But instead of spending his life practicing medicine, he became obsessed with financial markets. And Burry had a habit. He didn't just look at what everyone else was buying. He looked at the numbers underneath it. So he started studying the American mortgage market. And eventually, he found something that didn't make sense. Banks were giving mortgages to people who were unlikely to be able to afford them. Some borrowers had poor credit. Some had little money saved. And many mortgages had terms that could become much more expensive later. But banks weren't necessarily worried, because they weren't planning to keep those mortgages. They could bundle thousands of mortgages together, turn them into complicated financial products, and sell them to investors. The risk was being passed around, and because the housing market kept rising, everyone assumed the system was safe. But Burry saw something different. He believed that if homeowners started defaulting, those supposedly safe investments could become almost worthless. So he decided to bet against them. There was just one problem. How do you bet against the housing market? You can't exactly walk into a bank and say, I think houses are going down. I'd like to bet $100 million on it. Instead, Burry used something called credit default swaps. Think of them like insurance against certain mortgage bonds failing. If the bonds collapsed, Burry could make an enormous amount of money. If they didn't, he would keep paying for that protection. And that second possibility was becoming very painful. Because the housing market wasn't collapsing, it was still going up. Months passed, then more months, and Burry kept paying. His investors started getting nervous. They looked at their statements and saw money being spent on a bet that seemed completely insane. Some investors demanded their money back. Others questioned whether Burry had lost his mind. Imagine being an investor and watching your manager bet millions against the biggest housing boom in decades. While everyone around you's getting richer, you'd probably want out too. But Burry refused to change his position. He believed the numbers were wrong, not his analysis. Then, slowly, the cracks started appearing. People began defaulting on their mortgages. The housing market started weakening, and the complicated financial products built on those mortgages began to fall apart. Then came 2007. The subprime mortgage market started collapsing. And suddenly, the bet that had made Burry look insane started making him look like a genius. By the time the financial crisis exploded in 2008, banks were collapsing, markets were crashing, millions of people were losing their homes, and Burry's position was finally paying off. His fund made hundreds of millions of dollars for its investors. Burry himself made roughly $100 million. His investors made more than $700 million. But here's the part of the story that I find most interesting. Burry didn't predict the future with some magical ability. He didn't know exactly when the crash would happen. In fact, he had to wait years, while everyone around him thought he was wrong. What he did was much simpler. He looked at something everyone else considered safe and asked, what happens if it's not? That's a question most people don't ask when everything is going well. When prices are rising, people assume they'll keep rising. When everyone is making money, people assume the system must be working. And when everybody agrees, going against them feels almost impossible. That's why Burry's story isn't really about predicting the 2008 crisis. It's about being willing to look at the evidence, even when the evidence tells you something nobody wants to hear. Because sometimes the biggest opportunity isn't hiding inside something everyone believes in. It's hiding inside something everyone believes is impossible to fail. And Michael Burry was willing to bet millions that everyone was wrong. He didn't bet against the world because he knew he was right. He bet against the world because he was willing to find out if everyone else was wrong.